Hello and welcome to today's ACMP sponsored webinar. We value our ACMP members, and if you're visiting us today, we hope you'll enjoy our session. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. Our topic today is a new way to see change adoption, presented by Tigerhall. My name is Alan Bostakian, Director of Profession at ACMP Global, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. Registration is now open for our next in-person event, Change Orlando, May 17 to May 20th, 2026, of course. We have a limited number of discounted seats this year, so register now for your chance to experience cutting-edge insights and professional networking opportunities. We hope to see you in Orlando. We have two featured webinars coming up celebrating ACMP's 15th anniversary and the second annual Global Change Management Day. These are free and open to members and non-members. Register on our event page, please. Ready for others to see your expertise in change management and change leadership? The CCMP proves both your experience and knowledge in change management and shows your alignment with the ACMP standard for change management. Also signals trusted ethical practice, so you stand out and move up. And our new Master Change Management Professional MCMP designation is for those with their CCMPs and highlights your mastery in the profession. Apply for either today. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available in the resource library within 48 hours. We will also send out an email in the days following with a link that non-members can access to. All audio lines have been muted, and today's webinar will run until 1 p.m. Eastern Time. If you have any question during presentation, post it in the Q&A section. Questions for the presenters will be answered after the presentation. And be sure to join in the conversation and prompts from the speakers in the chat. Okay, let's see a short video from our sponsor, Tigerhall.
We're about to launch an AI-powered risk assessment tool for 5,000 employees. Adoption among our frontline teams is critical. Now, I'm ready to launch my transformation initiative. Since I've already got Tigerhall on Microsoft Teams, I don't have to jump between platforms. Everything's right where I need it. With AI Creator Studio, I can quickly turn a PDF about our AI-powered workflow automation into bite-sized role-based podcasts. Now, let's add this podcast into a change journey. To make sure employees actually listen to the podcast, I can automate sending them reminders right within their workflow. That way, it's all been taken care of, and it makes things so much easier. Lastly, I need to track the progress of the entire transformation from launch all the way to adoption. That's where the statistics dashboard comes in handy. I can see a quick snapshot of what's going on, like what content is resonating well, and even who needs support too.
Wonderful. And now I would like to welcome Nellie Wartoft, founder and CEO of Tigerhall. Nellie, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alan. And it's great to see all of you here. I'm enjoying following all the global international locations popping up in the chat, all the way from lots of people from Canada, Nigeria, Amsterdam, Ohio. Great to see you all here. ACMP is the favorite group for me to speak with. I always love talking to you guys. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here. 400 of you being in this room right now. Incredible, and looking forward to the conversation. I always get really good questions from you and really good commentary. So keep it flowing in the chat, and we'll have this next hour together to chat all about change activation maturity. So as Alan mentioned, I'm the founder and CEO of Tigerhall. Tigerhall is a change activation platform. So we support companies in building their change activation maturity and doing that through AI and technology, helping all of you do your work better. And one of the things that we've been diving into last year a lot is around the maturity when it comes to change activation. So when we start working with many of our customers, they really want to increase their maturity in change activation. And how do we go and become better in doing this and see higher change adoption, bigger impact, bigger ROI, and so on. So we actually did a whole study around what does it take to improve in change activation maturity and split this into 5 different stages. So what I'm going to talk about today and present to you is this maturity model. It's all the research that the team did last year and everything that we looked into to come to these 5 stages. I'm going to walk you through how that works, how you can apply it in your role. And of course, you're all going to receive it so you can do the test as well and see where you stand. And the final step is I'm going to talk to you about how do we bring this to the executive team. So how do we actually bring this to leadership to increase our activation maturity? So that's what we'll cover today. And starting off with what is change activation, right? Is I usually call this the invisible adoption gap, because people can have a great transformation strategy. You have all the change management in the world. We all know you usually don't, but let's say you have all the change management resources in the world, then we still see initiatives fail, right? It's still something that isn't clicking. And many times this does come down to change activation. And we should talk about something called the activation environment, which is basically the systems and the conditions which determine, can people actually pick this up? Because if you think of a change management plan, right, you have your impact assessments, you have your stakeholder maps, you have all of that prepared. Change management is still a very big part of it, is about planning. And you can have a beautiful plan, but once the plan hits the people, that's when many times things start to unravel. So when we talk about activation, it's really around how do we enable people to execute this in the real world, in practice, in the roles that they're in. And that's why it's many times invisible, because this tends to be the stage where change managers have the least visibility. And many times it feels like a black box. Like you send out some emails, you do some workshops, you set up some SharePoint sites, you push things out continuously, but you don't really know why are things working and why are they not working. So there is this black box once you've kicked it off. And then we all know the issue of sustainment. So you launch something and then pray to God that it works. And then you move on to the next project, right? For resource reasons as well. So when we look at change activation, the key pillars, and these are the 5 dimensions that I'll walk through today too, it's really about communication, the capability and capability building, the culture around the change, the feedback loops, and then the measurement. And the shift that we see people doing who are more mature in this is that's when you move from this change as a project, this more episodic way of looking at change, which tends to be a bit more of the traditional change management approach, to more, how do we build this as an always on capability? And in the conversations I have with change and transformation leaders every single day, this is the number one thing that they want to do is change is increasing. There are too many initiatives going on. It's too much change, and it's only going to get more and more and more, especially with AI and everything else going on in the world. So what most organizations want to do is they want to build this as an always-on capability. And that's where, when we look at that, the culture, the systems, the conditions around the change, that is what needs to be enabled before you can actually build that as an always-on capability. Because if you have this still like mindset of like change is a project, we have a start date and an end date, and then we run it as a project in a linear fashion, that's never really going to scale. And that's the big shift with change activation as well, is building that continuous, always on, scalable way of driving always on change. So when we look at this framework, looking at the research that we did, so of course we did this with all the Tigerhall customers. I'm also the chair of the Executive Council for Leading Change, which Tigerhall is leading. So we have about 1,000 leaders there that we involved in this research as well. So overall representing a few thousand different organizations that we've looked into how they're doing change activation and what actually determines where you stand in this framework, right? The goals of this is really how can we benchmark across these 5 different dimensions, and also uncover what are the hidden costs that people usually don't think about. For example, like you might have, say, like capability building, you bring in some consultants to run workshops and so on. Like, what are some of those hidden costs that we want to uncover? What's the path to that always on activation? Because one question that I'm getting asked every single day is, how do we build that capability? So what I just spoke about with that always on continuous change, how do we build always on activation? So we wanted to answer that question for people. How do you actually do it? And a lot of what people also say is they want to modernize change management. So that's a common word we hear, especially in the ACMP community, actually. Many people use this word of modernizing change management. And they feel like change management is behind so many other functions in the business, whereas all other areas are up to speed with technology and AI, and it feels very modern. Then change management is still there, like cranking out some PDFs for a SharePoint site, right? So that's a question I get a lot, especially from ACMP, is how do we modernize? So that's another goal that we had with this research, is to answer that question of how do we actually modernize change management and break it down to a more tactical level and translate to your day-to-day realities and what the tactical realities translate in terms of the framework. Okay, so I think we all know why it matters. I'm kind of preaching through the choir a bit here. I don't need to tell you why change activation is important. But I think what is interesting, when this is a generalized case study, when we looked at a few companies who have been through this journey. And what I want to highlight here, and you'll get the slides so you can read everything afterwards, but what I wanted to highlight here is the impact that people see when they move up these 5 different levels and dimensions of the change activation maturity model. So most of all, it's about the predictability. So this comes across both in terms of what improved. It made it much more consistent across initiatives. And this is something that I hear again and again, how change leaders struggle with consistency. And it's always this, you have a few initiatives that get all the attention, all the resources, and then others that just don't get anything. Or the very common problem of you've launched something, you don't have any resources for sustainment, so you just move on to the next one. So the biggest thing that, one of the biggest areas that people found that changed when they moved up this maturity curve is the predictability and the consistency. So that's one big takeaway. The second one is the reduced strain on the change team. So how much less manual follow-up was required and how much less manual work, because you're building really a system around it. So you don't, when you move from this project mindset to a more system mindset, you don't have this always on manual work, right? You have a lot more automated ways of working with it. And then a big part is actually around leadership. So the credibility and influence that change leaders got, because leadership gained a lot more visibility into what was slowing adoption. So one story I remember, especially around doing this work, is we had one of our customers said that before embarking on this journey and driving their activation maturity, he didn't really have a way to push back when leaders came to him and said, like, hey, my team isn't adopting. Like, my team isn't adopting. You need to do more. We need more change management. Like, they don't get it, this and that. Now this leader could actually point to the data because they had visibility, they had data around what was working and what wasn't, and also the reasons why. So it allows change leaders to come into these executive conversations with actual substance and backup and data, and not just what sometimes leaders can perceive as just like more rah-rah about change. Because change leaders can be good with coming in just like, oh, we need more change management, we need better change management, and executives are just like, I don't care about change management. But when you actually come with visibility into what's slowing adoption, how can we protect ROI, that's leading to very, very different conversations. So that's a big outcome of many of these case studies that we did as well. So that's a bit about the framework and background in the work that we did. What we're going to do is we're going to look at each of these 5 dimensions. And of course, we have polls, so you can also test a bit live, and then you can also go to the link and do the full assessment yourself as well. So the way this is structured, and you'll receive a PDF of this too, is when we look across communication, capability building, feedback loops, measurement, and sustainment, there are 5 levels to each of those. And after looking into what is it that people do in these different stages, we name them reactive as level 1 because when we looked at people in organizations who were in this stage, it was very much like change happens to me and I just try to do the best of it. I just try and keep up with it and send something here and there, but it wasn't really any thought to it. It was very reactive. So that's why we named level 1 reactive. Level 2, we named structured because there is some structure to it. They have like an intake process. They have certain things they do for every single initiative, but it's still very much that episodic, linear type of looking at it. Level 3, we named integrated because integrated, it's more integrated into the daily work of the organization than in level 2. In level 2, change management still kind of comes from the outside and says, hey, we need to do A, B, C and tick a box. Level 3, it's a bit more integrated into the organization. Level 4, we named scaled because it's really, when we looked at organizations at level 4, that's when we saw they're now able to start scaling this. So even with small change management teams, they can actually scale more work and take on more initiatives than they can in level 1 or 2. And then level 5, which very few organizations are at right now, that's when we saw that always on. And there are a few that we worked with and studied and did this together with that are at that level 5. And we'll walk through what are the steps to get to that level 5. One of the things that we learned in this work is that no one moves from level 1 to level 5 right away. So the focus is how do we get to like 1 or 2 next level? That's the healthy way of looking at it. And that's what I'll walk through next is what are those steps between the different levels? And it's not about going to 5 as quickly as possible, but rather identifying where are your weakest links and where can you start addressing some of those weak links to move up the maturity dimensions. Okay, so let's dive in. And we now got 500 people in the room. It's a great group. All right, communications. I know when you hear communications, you would also many times hear, oh, change management is just communications. It's just sending an email. And I know that this group is the first to say change management is so much more than communications. It's not just sending an email. And I fully 200% agree with all of you. This is not just communications, right? But we put communications as dimension 1 because it is the very first step. And if you don't nail communications, then it's very hard to nail everything else. If people don't know what is happening and what affects them, are they supposed to know how they should change at all, right? And it connects intent to what is the specific behavior that you're looking for. So the way that we look at communications is not just awareness driving. I know many people look at communications like, oh, we just need to inform everyone and tell everyone what is happening and go out with this information. That's one type of communications, probably more towards like level 1 or 2. But the way that we think about it is really, what's your strategy? That everything starts with strategy, right? And then what's the message that is key to unlocking that strategy? And then splitting it by different roles, which is extremely critical. And then communications that leads to an action, that leads to a behavior. And that is where I think many people might miss a bit in communications, is they don't think of communications, what is the action that we want? And some just go out and inform and blast and share information without necessarily even having an action that they're looking for. And if your communications doesn't have an intended action that you're looking to drive with that communication, then might as well not communicate, right? Because at the end of the day, change is about changing how we do things, changing how we think about something, changing our workflow, changing our process, and all of that requires action. So strategy, message, role, and action, that's kind of our definition of communication. And it cannot start if people don't see themselves in the change, right? I think this is the most critical part to communication, is that if people don't see that they are part of it, they're going to ignore it. And one of the biggest mistakes that we saw when we did the research, and that we still continue to see, is that organizations still love to blast. And they love tick the box blasts. And we have 10,000 people, we're going to tell them this is coming, and just send the same email to everyone or ask them to go to the same SharePoint site and hope they're going to figure out on their own how this impacts them. Let me tell you, no one figures out on their own how this is going to impact them. No one does. And just think of all the macroeconomic changes happening. Think like the stock market dropping today, for example. How many in the world's population do you think right away figure out how that's going to impact their pension, for example? No one. People just see that, oh, the stock market is dropping. No one understands this is how it's going to impact my pension, my real estate investments, my savings, anything, right? And that's an analogy that I usually use with executives when they think, but if we just tell people we're going to change this, they should understand, right? And if you're in finance and we're doing an ERP implementation, you should get how that's going to impact you. And I go, no, they don't. And then I give them the stock market analogy, and then many get it better after that. So feel free to use that analogy. And when you go out with these generic messages, they actually create more delay and they don't create any alignment at all. That's what we found. So they create more delay because people are like, okay, like they are more overwhelmed. There's been more communication coming at them. It does not drive alignment. And another thing that we discovered is that when people are silent in response to communication, that usually shows up as resistance later. So this is another reason why feedback loops that we'll get to in a bit is so key, because you want to test for levels of silence as well. But coming back to that action, how you want to do communications that drive action, people only act when it really maps to their specific role in the organization and they can see themselves in the change. So don't do things like org-wide AI adoption. We're all going to go into this. Go like, okay, what kind of AI are we implementing for the Japanese sales team or all sales managers? How does this impact different roles? That's a key thing. So when you do generic communication, then you usually see like low engagement and just replaces like the targeted guidance that people expect instead. And something we found is that you don't actually have to do, because some people think about it like this, as we realized, is people think you need to go generic first and then go targeted. So they think of it as like an inverse triangle in a way. In our research, we found that actually you don't have to do generic first. It's perfectly fine and actually many times more effective if you do targeted right away. So there's no need to blast the organization with mass communication. Just go right away. Hey, sales managers in Japan, we're doing this at an organizational level, and this is how it's impacting you. There's no need to blast the organizational level first. So I think that's a key insight from the communication aspect of this. And looking at then, how do we move up the curve when it comes to communication maturity, right? When we looked at these different levels, there are a few different things that organizations do. And we also mapped all of these behaviors and actions that organizations do in change activation with what's the adoption impact that they're seeing across their portfolio of initiatives. So the first one that many people start off with, this is usually when you're low on maturity, like change management is very nascent. You might have the one random change guy sitting deep under talent acquisition somewhere, and people are like, what does this guy do? That's kind of when you're at this mass emails town hall levels, because you don't really have resources to do anything else. So just blast the organization, tell everyone in town hall, do that big generic messaging. And the adoption impact is then super uneven, right? Like maybe it sticks, maybe it doesn't. You throw some spaghetti on the wall, see what happens. It's just all over the place and very, very hard to measure. Then we saw some organizations that started to manually tailor messages. So at least based on the most common ways to start are function and geography, which makes a lot of sense, right? Like, oh, we have the sales managers in Canada, or we have the finance team in France. And then they started manually tailoring these messages. And they many times used the assistance of sometimes HRBPs or country managers. It was a cascading motion. And that's why it's called like manually, because they didn't have a way to get to those directly. And the adoption impact there was very much depending on the effort that they put in, how much time they put in. So it wasn't very scalable, but it did work to some extent, right? And it also depended very much on who was local to that market or to that team. So when they had really strong managers, they saw higher adoption compared to if they had very bad managers, they saw lower adoption, right? So it was, again, very uneven and depending on who was in that role. Then the next step from that is we saw organizations doing targeted like partial automation. So you can see that this is when people are when a change initiative is hitting a certain milestone or a stage gate, you can start automating some targeting around specific timings in the initiative. And that could work. So that's when we started seeing much more adoption compared to the first two. And then automating it based on rollout stage. So where are you at in the journey? Where are you at in terms of the success, adoption, and so on? And then the final always on is adapting to the behavior of the individual. So when we look at the organizations that are most mature today, some like pharma companies, for example, they're very ahead of the curve in this compared to many other organizations. They do communications based on how the person behaves. And this includes sentiment, it includes attitudes, it includes how they're responding to certain initiatives and so on, and also whether they're doing the change or not doing the change. So if you think of, take technology implementation, being able to target and speak differently to people who are doing it compared to people who aren't doing it is a very, very big win. So that's when we speak about adapting to behavior, that's what this is referring to. And we saw the biggest impact on adoption is actually when you're able to target based on, I don't want to call it negative behavior, but let's say behavior that someone hasn't done anything. So take something simple. You're rolling out a new process of like applying for leave, something super simple. Someone who has not followed the process or has not applied for leave within the 7-day period that they're supposed to will then be automatically targeted with a very bespoke message around, hey, like we saw that you haven't applied for leave. This is why we're doing it this way now and how it changes and so on. So adapting it to non-compliant behavior is very, very effective in this stage. So, and that is what makes it very predictable, because then you can also look at all the data backwards and see like, okay, this is what ultimately leads to adoption. And if people ultimately adopt this in month 6, then this is what we're seeing as a corresponding behavior in month 1. So you can start doing predictive analytics as well around how are you driving adoption and what works with different audiences as well, right? So that's really the level 5 that we're talking about here. So let's do our first poll on this area and see like communications. If we can bring up the first poll and see where people are standing in comms right now. And this is a good sample size because we have 500 people in the group, so it will be almost statistically powerful. I think it's 1,000 people when it's statistically accurate, right? Oh, we have sometimes. We have 75% have responded. We'll give it another 15 seconds. All right, let's end the poll and share the results. All right, so a vast majority of you are level 1, 2, and 3. We have 3% in level 5. Would love to meet with you. Please do reach out afterwards. We'd love to learn more about how you got there and what you're doing. That's super interesting. And level 1, 2, 3, that mirrors kind of our findings as well. We had potentially a little bit more in level 2 than level 3. So I think that speaks to the expertise of this audience too. But overall in line with what we're seeing. There are a few at stage 4. That's what we found as well, because people tend to go from 3 to like 5. Like if you're on that path to like with automated journeys tied to the rollout stage, then you tend to just include like behavior and adoption and attitudes and so on with that as well. So people tend to just bundle stage 4 and 5. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. All right, so the next dimension is capability building. So once people know, okay, this is my role, this is how I'm affected by the change, this is what I'm supposed to do, then not everyone is capable right away to do it, right? And this is especially applicable to all the AI change coming out. Not everyone is an AI guru from day one. So having capability building around initiatives are critical. I think the key finding here that I want to emphasize is that we saw a lot of change management and change organizations focus on training, tracking like completion. And that was very much an input metric to their overall change management plan. And it was very much like have people completed it, have they attended it, like the standard traditional L&D way of measuring impact, but it's actually not measuring impact at all. And what we heard a lot was also that when leaders come and say like, hey, like my team is not adopting it, they're struggling, etc. We saw some change leaders responding, which is like, oh, they were trained. And that's like the explanation for it, which also doesn't really hold, because we all know that even if you deliver training, if people don't receive it at the time that they are actually open to it, or that the time that they need it, if it's not on demand and just in time, the effect is actually very, very low. And we still saw a lot of organizations having workshops, and like you get like 100 people into a room, you train them for an hour, and then they go away, and retention of those things are quite low, especially when it comes to changing workflow behavior, right? Because you get back to your desk, even if it's just virtual, you get back to your desk, and then you get back into your old behaviors, right? And a common connection that we saw is actually you could have really high completion rates and really low behavior change. So this was the main data point that made us go, actually, completion rate does not drive change impact or behavior change at all. And especially interesting, I think, was when new behaviors are much harder than the old ones. That's when we saw a lot of people reverting, especially under time pressure. We're like, oh my God, like I have like 2 minutes to send this invoice. I don't have time for this new AI thing that we launched, right? I'm just going to do it the old way. So time pressure was the biggest thing where people just reverted to the old ones. And also when support is missing. So when we get to the sustainment aspect, we'll talk a little bit about that. But old habits really come back very, very quickly when you don't have sustainment. When support goes out, like people feel that big like launch and like now we have this new initiative, but then people disappear. They go like, oh, if they've disappeared, I can also disappear and just go back to my old behavior. Like no one probably cares because they're not here anymore. That was a common sentiment that we saw. And something that makes this capability building sometimes hide a bit is that you see that adoption is slowing, but you don't really see any visible resistance. So this was another key finding, that you don't see people like being negative or like visibly arguing with things. Like they just don't do it. They just go back to their old ways. So one company in particular, they rolled out an ERP platform to a lot of manufacturing sites. And then I think it was 6 months or 12 months later, they went back to all the sites and asked them like, how is the platform performing? How's the system going? And the reaction in the plants were like, huh? Which platform? Like, what are you talking? Oh, like that thing you were talking about a year ago. And then they go, oh, no, like we do it like this. Like, and then they were a bit embarrassed, right? To show that it was like Excel sheets and manually, and like no one had adopted the system. And their response was literally, but you talked about this a year ago. That was a long time ago. That's not happening now. So just this absence of support, they right away went like, oh, that's probably not important because no one from HQ is here, right? So let's not bother with that. So nothing visible. The team in HQ thought it went super well and everything was going well. But then going out, it's just like, no one is doing it. So when we looked at what people are doing here at these different levels, one-off training leads to very, very rapid decay. People are just like, okay, done that workshop, right? Now let's get back to work. No one cares about one-off training. We saw some that were doing some more role-based programs. So that leads to a little bit more understanding, because coming back to the communications point, people understand this is why I should change and what I should do. Inconsistent, but works in some cases. The change-specific support at the integrated stage was something that we saw as well. It leads to more like higher effort than the other ones, but seems to work a little bit better as well. The in-workflow guidance is what had the biggest uptake from, like, this is when we saw the big unlock when people got to level 4. And what this means is, contrast this with a one-off training, right? You come to a workshop, you get it done, you go back to work, revert to your old behaviors. In-workflow guidance means take that manufacturing site again across all the different plants. When they're about to do something that is a process that now requires that new ERP, that's when they get the guidance. or when someone is about to apply for annual leave in the new system, that's when they get the guidance, right? Or you're doing an M&A when people meet their colleagues for the first time, that's when they get the guidance. So all of this in workflow motion is the biggest, a big impact on this. And that's also my personal biggest learning from running Tigerhall for the last 6 years is how much timing matters. That's probably something I did not expect to make such a big difference in adoption. But if you can deliver the right message, reinforcement, guidance, training at the right time to someone, it's like 20-25x on change adoption, minimum. It makes a very, very, very big difference to just have it at the right time. And this time can be workflow-based, process-based, but it can also be attitude-based, right? Like the moment someone changes their perspective on something or has a certain experience or meets a team for the first time or changes manager or like anything that happens, just delivering at the right time. If there's one takeaway that you have from all of this, then let that be it, how much timing matters. So don't do everything in January and roll out big training plans, but focus on how can you find these moments that you can actually go in and do delivery at specifically those moments. And then when we look at the always on, the adaptive support here, this is really coming back to the feedback flows as well, which we'll look at next, is how do we adapt support based on what people need? And this is one organization that we spoke with. They were very much around some people are just absolute superstars. You tell them to do something once and they just get it done. So why would you completely overwhelm them with hundreds of emails and trainings and this and that, like you would with anyone who's really struggling to adopt, right? And having that adaptive support based on both adoption and uptake, but also kind of attitude and like, yeah, like you tell me once, I get it done. That's going to be such a much better experience for them compared to just being overwhelmed with comms and training like the rest of the people. So being able to adapt to how people drive that behavior change or do the adoption, that's a big one as well. And that's really what leads to a lot of sustained behavior, because then you're driving more support for the ones who struggle and less support for the ones who don't, because they don't need it. So those were the findings in capability building. And we'll do a poll on that one too, to see where all of you stand on capability building. So we can launch the second poll. Give it 20 more seconds. We have 70% answered. All right, we can close the poll and share the results. So this is what your peers in this room are doing. So quite even between the first three, again, about 3% that are in stage 5. And I'm curious if that's the same 3% as in the first poll. If they're level 5 in both comms and capability building, that'll be very interesting. Most of you doing like support type specific change, role-based training, and 22% are still in that bucket of one-time training or reference materials. So very interesting. So lots of room to move up the levels, but also some of you that are ahead, which is great to see. All right, thank you. Third one then, feedback loops. And really the way to think about feedback loops, like some people, when you talk about this, they go like, oh, it's about like caring about people and how are people feeling, and it gets very mushy very quickly. And I'm like, no, like feedback loops is just about how early do you get to see problems. That's all it is. how early do you discover a problem? Because the problems will come. The problems will keep coming at every single change, every single stage, but how early do you detect them? That is what feedback loops are all about. So if you have any executive that is arguing about like, oh, like we don't care about how people feel, they just have to do it and this and that, and like the whole like human emotional side of it, just say no. Like, do you want to see the problems or not? How long do you want to keep your eyes closed? And if you want to have your eyes closed until shit hits the fan and we're in deep trouble and we've lost millions of dollars, that's on you. But I want to keep my eyes open and go into this change with actually seeing what the problems are. And I want to see them early so I can address them early so I can protect the ROI in this change initiative. So it's all about understanding execution reality. And when you look at if you cannot see something, then it's very hard to correct it, right? And a big thing that we discovered or like realized when we did this was the later the insight, the higher the cost. And it's almost like a very, in the organizations we looked at, it was a very direct correlation between time and dollars in this case. And I would say a lot of the changes we looked at were related to technology adoption. So that's, of course, a very big one. And the later people adopted, the more money you just waste. M&A was another big use case. And this, again, kind of like speaks for itself, right? If you don't understand the problems, then the merger is going to fail. And there is nothing more expensive than failed mergers and acquisitions. That is extremely costly. And then we also looked a lot at culture change, where the cost showed up in talent attrition, lost productivity, lost morale, like those kind of things. And then also commercial transformation is another big area. So think like re-transforming how you go to market, how you interact with customers, all of that leading to lost revenue, lost customers and things, of course, extremely, extremely expensive as well. So it gets very costly very quickly. And something that we saw was that when it's silence, people think that silence is just like, oh, everything is going well. So very similar to the case that I shared about the manufacturing plant with the ERP rollout, right? Like, oh, no one is saying anything, so they must be adopting it left, right, and center. Doesn't work that way. And in the UN, they have this in the signature from people in the UN that says silence amounts to acceptance, which is basically if you don't reply to an email, you just accept it. That's not how change management works. And I don't know how they do change management in the UN, but I hope that email line is not there for those specific emails. So don't believe silence means that everything is going well. And another big aspect of feedback loops is when people feel like they're being ignored, you actually have resistance harden, right, or increase. So just the very presence of feedback loops, even if people aren't sharing it or saying it, like just the presence of them existing is already reducing resistance. So those are the three top ones that we learned in this research when looking at feedback loops. And when you have these insights arrive too late, because some have feedback loops and some are like, yeah, we have a feedback loop in place, it works really well and so on. But again, the timing aspect of it makes a very big difference. So many times what we saw is that feedback loops would go out after adoption has already dropped. So you see that things aren't working. Oh, let me ask them why. And then it's already too late, right? Because your adoption is already going down. And then you have leaders being like, oh, like it was just quiet. And now we're seeing all of this resistance when it's coming too late. And then leaders can get a bit like, oh, like, why are we seeing this now? Why didn't they say anything? Like, why didn't we uncover this earlier? And then we see this very reactive approach from the change teams instead of seeing it early on, because it's really about how early do you want to detect problems. So looking at that reactive stage, right? No channels, blind execution. Some were doing some surveys, but the problem with this is, again, coming back to that time, like how early do you want to discover the problems? And you get very lagging responses when you just do like periodic surveys. Some had like one survey a quarter. Some even just do like the annual engagement survey. That is nowhere near enough, right? Some were then starting to do pulses, like pulse checks, and then you get some visibility. At least you get some kind of signal early out there. Then we'll come into scaled and always on. That's when we look at things like continuous channels. So how do we get this continuous, always on feedback channel? And also looking at signals. So in these first stages, it's very much depending on, like, it's very reliant on people saying what they think and expressing it in words. Whereas the closer to 4 and 5 you get, especially in 5, this is when you look at the signals. And you already know before someone has said, because no one is going to say, I don't want to adopt this or I hate this. But let's say before they say that, you can already see in certain signals, behaviors, actions they're taking and not taking. So it's shifting the feedback loops from like, hey, what do you think? Tell me in words, to, okay, we have all of this system here to like track different signals. And already then you can see what's going well and what's not going well. And that's what leads to that real-time steering, where you can actually see, how do we steer this based on the signals that we're getting without people even having to tell you in words. So that was another difference we saw moving up these 5 levels. So poll on this, if we can launch poll 3 and see where this group stands on feedback loops. So we have the third poll, Sean. Thank you. So how does your team usually learn today what's working and not working during a change? Give it another 15 seconds. You're 75% applied. All right, let's close the poll and share the results. So this is what your peers in this audience are doing. So 5% now level 5, so a little bit up from the 3% in the previous polls. And they're looking at real-time signals that surface as they emerge. 1 out of 5 are informally or only after issues escalate. So that, as we know, is too late. A large portion of biggest answer was through occasional surveys or check-ins. A lot of you doing that, and then some do regular feedback tied to specific changes. So also pretty even across the 3 first stages and a bit on the 4th as well, and then a small 5th. All right, interesting. Thanks for sharing. Okay, 4 out of 5 is measurement. And this is what determines how to intervene, right? So if you have the signals from the feedback loops, then you can determine based on measurement, what is the right intervention that you should make based on those feedback loops. And it's really like when adoption slows down, right, is when we're seeing when execution is more like debated and not so much directed. So if you have those like green, red, yellow signals, which I know many use, then a lot of the times those meetings would tend to go into debate on like, what does green mean? What is green? Is it really green? Are we seeing green? Like it's more about debating what is green is rather than are we seeing adoption, right? This kind of color system, as much as people love a color-coded dashboard, in our findings is not really the most effective way to look at change adoption. What is green, yellow, red? It's a simplified view, but you need the underlying measurement and metrics to be correct before you can go to actually knowing what it means. Leaders tend to rely on anecdotes very heavily, is one thing we found, and you can use this to your advantage, right? You can tell anecdotes and stories from the work that you're doing for them to understand what works and what doesn't. So we actually found many times that anecdotes are sometimes more effective in telling a story than showing data, and definitely more effective than showing green, red, yellow. And then many times you can see that when people are under pressure, then measurement tends to be sometimes the first out of the 5 dimensions to go out of the way. So everyone goes, let's measure later. We can look at it after the fact as opposed to doing it in real time. So those are some of the key things. And a lot of organizations are still doing retrospective reporting. So this was a key thought or key learning in looking at how people measure is it's still very, very retrospective. And the key in moving up these levels is how do we make it more real time every day and not just wait until once something has happened. So many have data that takes weeks to put together. So even in the instances where you have a data lake, you have a central point of repository where you actually can get the data, because some are not even there. Some are not even like, I don't even have data. I don't have access to it. But even in cases where people did, it's usually weeks to put a dashboard together. And by the time the dashboard is put together and it's prettified in a PowerPoint deck and so on, then the data is already out of date. So that was a big challenge that we saw, is that it takes usually 4 to 8 weeks to put together a dashboard. And we all know that a lot of things can change in 4 to 8 weeks. So when you're looking at the data, it's no longer relevant. A lot of argument and debate about interpretation. So I think this is a big area for the profession and the industry as a whole. Like, can we get more solid on how we interpret these different metrics? And then given that the data arrives too late, and then you spend time arguing, debating what it means, then the actual intervention to shape and change how it's going, it comes way too late. So in many instances, we saw that even when you had feedback loops and good measurement in place, an intervention might take 90 days to launch. So next quarter, you have something going out to these people, but they've been already doing the wrong thing or not doing it or brewing negative sentiment for 90 days. And that's a very, very long time. So looking at what people were doing in these different levels, like I would say, I mean, we also saw people just doing nothing, right? So that deserves to be said. Like even activity tracking, if you're doing this at the moment, it is sometimes more than what many organizations are doing too. So there are people who are doing no tracking, no measurement, they have access to no data, and everything is just completely flying blind into a black hole. But we still wanted to put activity tracking as reactive, because that's kind of what, once you're out of doing nothing, that's the lowest level after that. Some were then moving into lagging KPIs. So this comes to that issue of it's looking at the past, not real time, and it's way too late. Manual adoption data. Some were spending a lot of time working with IT, getting access to the right data, exporting from different system sources, manually putting it together in a Power BI or tons of pivot tables. And one that we spoke with even had a full-time hire just doing this. So one person just doing manual adoption data and putting it together from all the different systems. And then, of course, time becomes a big issue as well. Then in these two, we started seeing more automated dashboards. So these are people who are pulling in, like you have a Power BI, you pull from the data lake, you have things that are automated and they can update on a daily basis, and then gets a lot more proactive. And then the final stage is when you have the measurement at a more individual and behavior-driven level, right? So when we think of automated dashboards, many here we're looking at things from you have some comms measurement, you have adoption measurement from the technology tool that you're implementing, you have surveys, you have LMS data, you have all of these things coming together. When we looked at the fifth stage, the differentiator here is you combine this with the specific audience data. So you can actually have this based on different stakeholder groups. And when I say stakeholder groups, not just geography and role, but also attitudes, what behaviors are they displaying, are they adopting it, are they not? So all of those behavior-led measurement that leads to what behavior leads to what outcome, and that's what you measure around. So that's really when you've optimized it. So poll on this, if we can launch poll 4, where do we stand on this as a group? And this is an example of good measurement, right? When you see live what people are voting, is so fascinating. Give it 10 more seconds. All right, let's close the poll and share the results. So also looking fairly similar to the previous polls. actually. So again, about a third on level 1, third on level 2, third on level 3, and then a small, tiny percentage on level 5. So 2% there. All right. Coming up to the last one on sustainment. Thank you for sharing those results. So sustainment is the one that usually gets ignored, right? And we know this, we're launching an initiative and then we're very quickly on to the next. And sustainment tends to get ignored. Looking at this, one key realization was that most change actually doesn't fail. And I know when people are like, oh, change initiatives fail, like again, it gets into a debate of definitions and so on, but it does fade. So you see it slowly dying over time, right? And then next year, there's a new change initiative to combat what happened in the previous initiative and what didn't go right in the previous initiatives. So you see a quiet decline of that initial uptake, and new hires tend to not adopt. That's another good signal to look at when you look at sustainment, because you should have, if something is sustained over time, when people start joining a team or joining the company, they should be able to adopt it too. And then what you're seeing is that reinforcement depends very much on people's individuals' memory and if they remember or not. And you start seeing those old behaviors resurface as well. So when we look at the different levels here, you can see that sustainment sometimes comes in the form of posters and slogans. You put it in the kitchen and hope that people remember it. Doesn't lead to much sustainment over time. You see some doing like leaders remind them and like chasing people, and that again comes down to who is the leader and how good are they at doing this. And then you see some deploying it through champion networks, right, which again is uneven and highly dependent on the champion. Looking at level 4 and 5, this is when we start seeing when it's more embedded and coming back to that workflow point. And if you can deliver it at the right time, that's when you see a very high uptake and the embedded reinforcement. And when you look at the always on, that's when you can start seeing detection as well. Like, are people starting to drift away from it, and how can you reinforce it better over time? So I think speaking of time, I think I'm probably out of time, and I see that Alan has come up as well. So I think we'll skip this poll. And what I wanted to share last is across these different stages. So we will share this with you afterwards so that you can look at all of these different 5. And then if you want to look at your own maturity score, you can go to tigerhall.com/CAMM, so Change Activation Maturity Model. There's an assessment there. You can take it, look at all of these 5 different levels. You'll get a summary of your score. You get actions for what to do, what the outcome is, and how you can tackle it. And we'll also share this with you about how to leverage it with your executive team and how to do that. But I'll leave you with going to this link, and we're happy to share more about it. Feel free to spend more time with me and the team, and we can share more about how you can climb up the maturity scores as well when we have a bit more time. Thanks again for coming and joining and listening in. I appreciate your time. And over to you, Alan.
Thank you so much. So let's have 1 or 2 questions maximum. We have only 3 minutes covered, and if possible, and then I'm gonna wrap up in 1 minute.
Right, yeah. So the first question I have here is from Shanna, and it's what kind of systems or tools are necessary to allow just-in-time in workflow guidance during change initiatives?
So this is something that change activation platforms support with, right? So Tigerhall is one platform you can use for that, that looks at when do people take certain actions and then deliver it to them directly in the workflow. And yeah, so a change activation platform is what you would need to look at.
Do we have one more, Alan, or it's up to you?
Let's do 1 more, please.
Awesome. So from John, how do you see the impact of AI in increasing change adoption, especially in companies where you talk about that there's only one person?
Very good question. And I would plug a webinar I'm having tomorrow, actually. If you want to drop the link to this in the chat, Julie, because I have a webinar tomorrow on how you can leverage AI to drive adoption too. A sneak peek is a big part of is decentralized change and how AI actually supports you in decentralizing it, enabling the rest of the organization to do it, building capability beyond your own change team. So I'm going to speak about that tomorrow. I think it's about the same time, if I'm not wrong. But we can share the link to it in the chat, and I'm going to speak about that tomorrow for about an hour or so. So welcome to join.
Okay, thank you so much, Nelly. I want to thank everyone for participating in this wonderful ACMP webinar today. And I would especially like to thank Nelly again of Tigerhall for the fantastic presentation. Immediately after the webinar, the feedback survey will pop up. Please take just a few moments to complete the survey as your feedback helps us shape future webinars. Don't forget to join Webinar Exchange community in ACMP Connect, if you are a member, of course, to continue the conversation and engage with our speaker and fellow participants. This recording will be available within 48 business hours in the webinar section in ACMP Resource Library located on the ACMP website at acmpglobal.org. And an email will go out to non-members with a link to the webinar. If you already have your CCMP, remember that by attending this webinar and all webinars, you can earn PDUs towards maintaining your CCMP. So record your hours today. Thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next time.